Hey guys, welcome. It is Bible Scribe. Thank you for joining me. This video is about the 5,500 year prophecy. Now, I've been studying this prophecy a long time, and my initial study started when I found this the first time in what's called the first book of Adam and Eve. Now, we in this video are going to see a ton of other sources that have this in it, including church fathers, different writings. Now, and that's going to reinforce it. But I just want you to know that when I bring these videos, I have generally done a lot of research and study that has led up to me actually producing the video. I have a folder full of about, at this point, 50 or 60 different documents on topics that I am preparing for videos. It's just a matter of having the time to finish them, finding enough information that makes me feel like it's worthy of making a video on, and having enough sources that it's worth your time. I don't want to bring a video that makes a bunch of speculations and then doesn't give you the things that you can go find and research and back it up with. And so I try to do that. But this prophecy has been with me for a while now, and I'm so excited to get this video out to you. So just the brief background is that this prophecy matches a timeline that is given in the Septuagint. But we're going to see a lot of other sources that give the same timeline. And so it is reinforced time and again. And what this is that Adam was given a prophecy by God just after he left the Garden of Eden. And that was that in 5,500 years that he was going to send the Redeemer, Christ, to redeem him from death, essentially, from Hades. And so that is what we're talking about, that the time period from Adam and from creation to the time of Jesus Christ coming was 5,500 years. So with that premise, we'll get started. I'm going to first show you a timeline so that we can get in our heads kind of how this is going to play out. I've put together visually for you to see it, and that always helps me. I love doing timelines, but you can see here I've now added to the screen just a line with demarcations, and you can see that we're going to start, as this prophecy does, at 0, and at the top it starts at 0 from creation, but on the bottom it's going to be Gregorian calendar years, so that's 5,500 BC. So that makes our timeline work in both the AM years, which is on the top line, and the BC and AD years, which is the bottom line. So just to start us off on our timeline, I will put in two things, and that is when Adam receives this prophecy, and that's right there after the Garden of Eden, and then when Christ comes, and that would be at the 5,500 year mark, if you can see that now. And so this shows you how this timeline is going to work, but let's go ahead and add some more things so you see in totality where all this plays out. So the flood, according to this Septuagint based timeline, is right about there, 2,200 or so years after creation. And then Abraham comes along about there, 3,400 or so years. And then now there's Israel. The time frame of Israel is from Abraham to Christ, and that is about 2,000 years, give or take, and that's that time period displayed for you there. I'll zoom in a little bit now so you can start to see some of that a little better as we're back here before Christ. Now the temple was built at this time frame, so Israel was in existence long before they built the temple, but then Solomon came along and built it. It was destroyed, and then it was rebuilt about 515 BC, and then finally destroyed again in 70 AD during Christ's parousia and the judgment that God exacted upon the wicked Jews, all right, who did not accept Christ. And to put it on here, I love prophecy, and this is Daniel's 70 weeks would be right here. And then the book of Revelation gives us some things that I'm going to put on our timeline right there. I'll move the temple stuff back out. But you can see now how that's shaping up. That when Christ came, it was AD 70, the temple was destroyed, the seals, trumpets, and bowls were opened and poured and blown, and then the millennium starts. The martyrs, the saints, the tribulation saints are taken to heaven, put on thrones. Satan is bound at that time, And the millennium occurs then for 1,000 years. And then Satan loosed at the end of that millennium, about 1070 AD, or in AM years, it is about 6,500 or so AD. And so then after that, when Christ came, he established his kingdom. So that's the kingdom up top. And it started at Christ and goes on now forever. And it is in heaven, according to Christ's own words. So that is it. And then, of course, right now is on the timeline right there. So we are at the AM year 7,500, according to this prophecy and this timeline of the Septuagint. And I have come, after what you're going to see in this video and all my study, I have come to believe that this timeline right here is truly the correct timeline of the scriptures and of history. And you're going to see throughout this video, we're going to go into sources next. It's just countless, the number of sources and early Christians, early church fathers that wrote about this and supported this 5,500 years between Adam and Christ, between creation and Christ. And that this timeline is truly the timeline, it's God's timeline for history. And so, that being said, let's jump now to, let me get prepared some of these sources and we'll start looking through them. So to start out with, my first source that I found was the first book of Adam and Eve. And in chapter 3 of that, God says to Adam, I've ordained on this earth days and years. Your seed will dwell and walk in it till the days and years are fulfilled. And then in chapter 3, verse 6, he says, Then God in his mercy for Adam, who was made after his image and similitude, explained to him these were the 5,500 years, how one would then come and save him and his seed. So Adam, creation, 5,500 years later, Christ was going to come, the Messiah, and redeem Adam and his seed, the ones who had to die now because of sin. He was going to redeem them from Hades and take them out. And so 5,500 years prophecy is given right there. And just so you know, this might be the only place where the prophecy is talked about, the only book that talks about the actual prophecy given to Adam. Others hint at it, but this one is the one that actually records it. So you've now seen that. So let's jump on ahead. The book of Enoch is another one that reinforces this idea. Now, you know the story of the Watchers, hopefully, and the Watchers, who were fallen angels, came down and they procreated with women and did against the Lord's commands. They were bound then for 70 generations. It says when their sons, the sons of the Watchers, the Nephilim, had slain one another and seen to the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast, God says, for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth until the day of their judgment and consummation. The judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. So this would be 70 generations till a final judgment that they were to undertake and go through for what they did. And then in Enoch chapter 18 and 21, in that time frame of the book, angels were bound for 10,000 years. And this was for those angels who were luminaries of the heavens that had transgressed their commands by the Lord, their given orders of how they were to shine in the heavens and move through the heavens. And when they disobeyed that, they were imprisoned for 10,000 years. So this doesn't say 5,500 as far as our prophecy, but it confirms a timeline of existence for these angels that's in the 10,000 year range, and then kind of helps, bookend what we're talking about and say, wow, a 5,500 year prophecy from Adam to Christ makes sense within the context of a 10,000 years till a final judgment of these transgressing angels. And then in chapters 91 to 94 of Enoch, we have the prophecy of 10 weeks, which I've gone over in other videos. Probably do another video on it soon. But it reinforces this 5,500 years from Adam to Christ, because in the middle of week 6, the 6th time period of the 10, it says, a man shall ascend, and the house of dominion will be burnt with fire. Well, that mirrors what? The first century, when Jesus Christ ascended to the throne of God, and then the house of dominion, the temple on earth, was burnt with fire and judged in 70 AD. So that mirrors the first century, and then in that way confirms, because of the 10 weeks, and it's in the middle of the 6th week, that would be about 5,500 years. That confirms our prophecy of 5,500 years. The other writing I saw early on when I was studying this was the Gospel of Nicodemus. And it says in this chapter 22, verse 12, thou shalt make, he's talking about God talking to Moses. He says, you will make an ark of testimony. This is the ark of the covenant. He says that in 2 cubits and a half shall be the length, and a cubit and a half the breadth, and a cubit and a half the height. And so that was the dimensions God gave, even in the Hebrew script, in our Bible, for the ark of the covenant. But then it goes on and expounds on that and says, by these 5 cubits and a half for the building of the ark of the covenant, we perceived and knew that in 5,000 years and a half, 5,000 and a half years, that Jesus Christ was to come in the ark of his body. So this is saying that these early Christians believed that the Ark of the Covenant displayed that 5,500 year prophecy in its dimensions that God gave. And that was the whole reason God gave those dimensions, was to reaffirm that prophecy with Adam. And it says, it gives then in the verses 16 through 19, it gives a bunch of different time periods, talking about the time from Adam to the flood, to Abraham, to Moses and David. And then in the end, it says the sum of all these amounts to 5,000 and a half. So then it definitely reaffirms this 5,500 years from creation to Christ. Another writing I found that enforces this is the Discourse on Abaton. And when the 5,500 of years are fulfilled, I will send my beloved Son into the world, says God. And he shall abide in a virgin womb, that is to say, the Holy Virgin Mary, and she shall give him birth on earth in lowliness and humility. And this goes on and on about Christ and what is all going to happen with Christ. But just to show you that this definitely reinforces specifically this 5,500 year prophecy. Oh, and by the way, at the end of that passage, for thy sake, O Adam, the Son of God, shall suffer these things till he has redeemed thee and restored thee to paradise unto the place where you came from. So this was just the understanding of the early church fathers, by the way, and the early Christians, was that Jesus had come to redeem Adam out of Hades, take him back to paradise, which was, by the way, the Garden of Eden was a spiritual place. It was not a physical place. And this is how all the ancients understood it. And this is in a lot of different passages in other books as well. But that God was going to restore man to that garden, to that paradise, specifically Adam and his seed. Now, the rest of these, I'm going to give you a ton of references to different other early Christians and church fathers. They all talk about things that relate to this 5,500 years and that reinforce this timeline of the Septuagint that is the same as this 5,500 years. So let's go through those. I'll try to go quick. I don't want this to take too long because there's so many. And that just reinforces this whole idea of the 5,500 years between creation and Christ. In Josephus' Antiquity of the Jews, he says, they, meaning the sacred books of the Jews, indeed contain 5,000 years of history, in which time many strange things happened. So, of course, Josephus, writing in the 1st century, talking about the books of the Jews which had been written earlier than him, saying that they contained at least 5,000 years worth of all these different miraculous happenings. And so he, in that case, reaffirms this 5,500 year period. The Epistle of Barnabas says he finished in 6 days, meaning God's creation, and implies that he will finish all things in 6,000 years, for a day with him is as 1,000 years. So then all things will be finished. So a lot of these early Christians they knew the time periods, and so this reaffirms our 5,500 years until Christ, but then they knew they were awaiting that 6,000th year, and they thought something big was coming. They didn't know exactly, but they thought perhaps the final judgment of all things was at that 6,000 year mark, and then the Sabbath 7,000th years. But that's not really what happened in history, we know now looking back, but they were concerned, some of them. And so you're going to see this kind of thing a lot, where they expected that final judgment to be at the end of the 6,000 years, but it did not occur then. It's still in the future. Irenaeus said this. He says, the sixth day of creation, on which day man was created, thus granting him a second creation by means of Christ's passion, which is that Adam to the 1000th year. So he said the days of creation and the day in which Adam was made, the sixth, was a mirror of the 6,000 years of history, and that in that 6,000 years, that was when Christ was going to redeem Adam. Of course, that's the 5,500 year mark, and that confirms our prophecy we're looking at. Theophilus, 150 or so AD, gives a bunch of the different time periods of the Old Testament, and then says all the years from the creation of the world amount to a total of 5,698 years, 5,698 years to his time, the time of Emperor Aurelius Verus, the current Roman emperor, when he was writing this. So he again reaffirms the 5,500 years to Christ. Clement of Alexandria says, from Adam to the deluge are 2,148 years. And he gives a bunch of other time periods, but long story short, that confirms the time periods of the Septuagint, which confirms the 5,500 years. So in that Septuagint timeline, there's about 2,200 years between creation and the flood, and that's what he echoes, Clement of Alexandria. He also says this, from Adam to the death of Commodus, the Emperor Commodus, 5,784 years. So again, confirms that timeline. Bardesanes, in about 150 or so AD, says that there will be required 6,000 of years for all of time. And so he just confirms this. Hippolytus says this, that in the year 5,500 he suffered in the 33rd year, talking about Jesus Christ. So from the first appearance of our Lord was in the year 5,500, he says, confirming our prophecy exactly. Julius Africanus says this, many have handed down to us by the Hebrew histories, the number of 5,500 years is the period up to the advent of the word of salvation, or Jesus Christ. And so he again confirms this. Origen then confirms it as well. The Mosaic account of creation teaches that the world is not yet 10,000 years old, but much under that. So Origen was arguing with some of the different scholars of his day, some of which held to different time frames. But he's saying, no, it's always been known that it's way less than 10,000 years. And so that in that he affirms that at least it could be something similar to our 5,500 years. Cyprian of Carthage says this, 6,000 years are now nearly completed since the devil first attacked man. So he confirms that the 5,500 had passed till Christ, and that they were now coming close to the 6,000 year mark in the 3rd century when he lived. So Victorinus on the creation of the world says this, that as I have narrated, the true Sabbath will be in the 7th millenary of years, when Christ with his elect shall reign. So he's saying the 6,000 years are almost done. We're looking forward to that 7,000 years, because that's when Christ will reign. And of course, some of the early church fathers thought this reign was going to be on earth. Some did not. Christ himself said that it was a heavenly kingdom. So I think that in that sense, we can be assured that that's what it was. But that obviously did not come to pass the way Victorinus thought. But again, he confirms this time frame that they saw themselves just before the end of the 6,000 years, ready to start the 7,000 years. 7,000 years. Eusebius says this, by Moses, containing the laws and traditions respecting the origin of man, that period embraces nearly 3,000 years. And I'm kind of boiling that down, but this period he's talking about, the way he describes it, matches the Septuagint timeline and matches our 5,500. Lactantius in Divine Institute says, truth must labor during these 6,000 years while wickedness prevails and bears rule. At the end of the 6,000th year, all wickedness will be abolished from earth. So again, you see another one of these church fathers hoping that at the end of the 6,000, that all wickedness would be abolished, that the judgment would come, the final judgment. We know that didn't happen, but they were thinking that could happen. And of course, we have people in our day that speculate the same way. So I don't hold it against them in any regard at all. The more I read of the early church fathers, the more I understand, honestly, about the Bible. And so I would encourage you to spend time, if you spend time in any other books outside of the Bible, spend them in the early church fathers. The early ones, the pre-Nicene church fathers. Irenaeus, Clement, Polycarp, these guys, Justin Martyr. Read them. It's so good. It'll help you so much. Methodius says this, therefore they say that an age of 6,000 years extends from Adam to our time. So again, he confirms the 5,500 to Christ and the additional years till his time. So they knew the 6,000 was coming close. Commodianus says, we shall be immortal when 6,000 years are accomplished. He again confirms they're waiting for the 6,000 to finish, and that Commodianus thinks that they're going to be raptured essentially, or go straight to heaven and be immortal. And he says this again in another section, when 6,000 years are completed, the world has come to an end. So some of them thought this, some of them were looking for this, completion of the world. Ephraim, the Syrian Nizabene hymns, says this, to thee be glory who didst descend and plunge after Adam. This is talking about Christ. And draw him out from the depths of Sheol and bring him into Eden. I marvel at this seed and at your words, for lo, after 5,000 years. So he confirms our time frame when Christ came 5,000 or so years after Adam and went to Hades to pluck him out of the depths of Hades and take him back to Eden. Restore him to where he had been. Now, John Chrysostom says 5,000 years and more have passed, and death has not been done away with on account of one single sin. So Chrysostom confirms our time period and says that death had not been done away with in his time period in the 4th century. Death had not been done away with, and they knew that 5,500 or more years had passed when Christ came. And he also says, but the world, though subsisting now 5,000 years and more, has suffered nothing of the kind. Again, confirming our time frame. Methodius says this, at an age of 6,000 years extends from Adam to our time. So again, confirms the same thing. He says, when this world shall be terminated at the 7,000 years, when God shall have completed the world. So again, this idea that they had that's still in their future at the end of 7,000 years was going to be the end of the world, which we know that didn't occur. 7,000 would have taken us into, 1500 or so AD? And so we know that that didn't occur then. And that is to say, if our calendars are correct, right? I'll just throw that out for fun. It'll get your brain spinning. Jerome says, in the 10th generation, 2,242 years afterwards, God, to vindicate himself, gave the commandments. Okay, so again, this confirms our timeline. 2,242 years, the commandments from the time earlier, and this confirms our timeline from the Septuagint. Sulpicius Severus says, as I reckon, 2,242 years after the beginning of the world was when Noah came into the out of the ark. So that's, again, the same Septuagint timeline, confirming our prophecy of 5,500. Augustine says, reckoning the years from Adam, 7,000 years. So that 7,000 should pass as 7 days afterwards, as it were the 8th day. So he confirms this same time frame, the same way of calculating time. So many years have passed since Adam, the 6,000 years are being completed in his day, Augustine says. He expects that they will be completed soon. He mentions the Egyptians who calculated theirs and said there were 100,000 years of history, and he's saying that's ridiculous. Everyone knows that's not correct. And he says that there's the falseness of this history, which allots many thousands of years to the world's past, confirming that it's a shorter time period like the 5,500 years. I'm not going to go into more Augustine. He continuously talks about it. Obviously, that's his view. Theodoret of Cyrus in the 4th and 5th century says this, when more than 2,200 years had gone by after Adam to the flood. Okay, so again confirms the same timelines as all the rest. All right, So now we're going to talk just a little bit about the authority of the Septuagint, because that's where a lot of these early church fathers, the writings we just went through, they got their timelines and their basis for this from the Septuagint, because the genealogies in the Septuagint, they add up to this same 5500 time period, okay? But Josephus, in his Book of the Antiquities of the Jews, book 12, in fact, the whole book, which is pages and pages of information, is about the writing of the Septuagint and the interpretation that the 70 elders did of that work. The 70 Jewish elders, and this was a few hundred years BC, all right, that this was done. So he says, when the law is transcribed, the labor of interpretation was over, came to its conclusion in 72 days, on and on he goes. I just wanted to show that this was in here and that Josephus recognizes the Septuagint as authoritative and essentially as scripture itself. Justin Martyr in 160 AD says, the interpretation made by the 70 elders who were with Ptolemy of the Egyptians is a correct one, and they attempt to frame another. He's talking about the Jews, that the Jews at the time of the 1st and 2nd century, after Christ had come and God had judged them and destroyed the temple, the Jews were trying to change their scriptures because they didn't want anyone to come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ had been the Messiah. And so they, I believe, at that time changed the time frames. They changed some of the dates and the genealogies. They changed and took out some different things out of the prophecies, and it altered altogether the Hebrew scriptures. And Justin Martyr also says the Jewish teachers have altogether taken away many of the scriptures from the translation of the 70. So Justin's saying we have the 70, the Septuagint as authoritative, but yet the Hebrews now, the Jews in the 2nd century, are starting to take things out of that, and they are going by a different translation, using a different translation. Irenaeus in 180 AD says, the Lord himself saved us, giving us the sign of the Virgin, but is not, as some allege, meaning some of the Jews, presuming to expound scripture as, behold, a young woman will conceive. So this is the prophecy out of Isaiah that talks about that Jesus Christ, the Messiah, would be born of a virgin. And he's saying that at this time period in the 2nd century, the Jews were trying to change the scripture to say not virgin, but young woman. And why can you think that would they do that? It's because Jesus Christ had been born of a virgin, and this is what all the church fathers were saying. All the Christians at this time, they were talking about this all the time. And the Jews had to do something to make people not think Jesus was the Messiah. They hated Jesus Christ. Hippolytus in 205 AD says, at this point we have an asterisk. The words are found in the Hebrew but do not occur in the Septuagint. So Hippolytus just confirming that the Septuagint, the Jews had used the Septuagint, now they were taking things away from it or including things that didn't belong in an effort to destroy the matching of the prophecies to Jesus Christ. Origen in 240 AD, I make it my endeavor to not be ignorant of the various readings, otherwise in my controversies with the Jews, I might quote to them what is not found in their copies. Also, I want to make use of what is found there, even though it is not in our scriptures. So Origen's saying they used the Septuagint as had been used even by the Jews before Christ came, and now the Jews were arguing against the Septuagint. It's after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Jewish leaders started to disregard the Septuagint. New Greek translations were created during the 2nd century, and this is what the early church fathers were talking about. And they were using an uncertain Hebrew source for those translations. Augustine said to Jerome, because Jerome in about 380 AD, 390 AD, was going to translate the entire Bible into Latin. This is what Jerome did as part of his work. But Augustine was imploring him with letters, and this is one of them. He implored him to translate the Old Testament from the Greek Septuagint and not the Hebrew sources, because Augustine argued that these Hebrew sources of that time period were incorrect, and that the Septuagint was authoritative and correct. So that brings me to another topic, and that is just so we understand what has happened, and because this discussion also lends credence to this short timeline of the Old Testament of the 5,500 years between creation and Christ. This term Anno Mundi, and it means in Latin, year of the world. And Anno Mundi is a a term for calendars that calculate the year, the current year, based on the creation of the world, based on creation. So the calendars that do that, this is a list of all different calendars from all over the world. And so you can see there's all these weird ones, different ones based their different countries throughout history. Ancient civilizations have based their calendars on different things. Like the Japanese calendar right now is based on something 30 years ago. The Buddhist calendar and the Thai calendars are based on some dynasty that was just pre-Christ. And so their year for this year is about 2062 or so. The Islamic calendar bases its years on Muhammad, right? And so it's only 1439 in the Muhammad or the Islamic calendar. The Unix calendar from software and computers right now starts in January of 1970. So apparently, according to the Unix calendar and software, there is no history before 1970. It's kind of funny. The Ethiopian calendar says that the current year is about 2010 or 2012. And that is because they base a lot of their history, religion. They have a strong Jewish and Christian foundation in their country. And so they have based it on since Christ came. Now, the two that I'm most interested in here is the Hebrew and the Byzantine calendars. And the reason is because this Hebrew calendar, which starts in 3761 BC, according to Maimonides, a rabbi from the 12th century, that follows the timeline of the Masoretic text perfectly. The Masoretic text having been translated by Jews in about 900 or so AD, 1,000 years after the Septuagint. And that timeline is compressed from what the Septuagint had. It changed it. They changed it. And so that matches what's in a Masoretic text and is in many modern versions. And you've look at the genealogies in our modern versions, you'll see those years add up to this 4,000 or so years before Christ is when creation started. But the Byzantine calendar, which is the basis of almost all Western modern calendars, before the Gregorian calendar, which also based itself on the Byzantine, it keeps intact the 5,500 years from creation to Christ and the additional years since. And so the Byzantine calendar calculates the current year at about 7,528 for 2020. These numbers were from 2 years ago. So it's interesting to me that the most anciently based calendar, the Byzantine calendar, supports our view of this 5,500 years till Christ. Whereas the Hebrews, the modern Hebrews, which are apostate, they don't accept Christ as the Messiah. Their calendar and their Masoretic text that they hold in high regard has a skewed timeline that de-emphasizes Jesus Christ as the Redeemer. That tries to trick you into thinking that the timeline set up by God for the redemption of man did not occur when it did, which was at the time of Jesus Christ. And so in this way they have deceived Christianity in general and have deceived all the world. And they are looking now for a Messiah in a false year that's not the correct year. It's not the correct timeline. And so the Jews, the modern Jews, have perpetuated a future type view of the coming of the Messiah. Because according to their calendar, 5778, actually, even in that calendar time frame, they should have already had their Messiah, but they have not yet seen the one they want to call Messiah. But Jesus Christ was the Messiah, and he came in the exact appointed time by God himself. According to this prophecy that we now understand is 5,500 years from creation is when Christ came. And he did it. I mean, it was perfect. It's interesting to me, I found in this study that Russia kept this Anno Mundi calendar, this Byzantine calendar, and they counted their years from the creation of the world, placing Christ at 5509 as far as their calendar, and that even up until the 15th century, Russia kept and held that calendar. Even when the Pope Gregory XIII, established the Gregorian calendar and changed everything. All right, and so we want to ask who and what changed everything, and that, like I said, it was Pope Gregory XIII. And this Gregorian calendar now is used in most of the world. And named after Pope Gregory, of course, the 13th. He introduced this calendar in October of 1582. And what's interesting to me is because I've studied a lot of these different groups in this time period and what happened. It's interesting to me, and I'll just show and share these events in that time period so that you can think about this and do your own study on these things. Just remember that the ancient calendars and the Hebrews, everybody calculated all of their time periods, all of their years, all their months, based on the movement of the moon and the sun. All right? The Hebrews based their most ancient calendars on the moon. And so there was the cycle of the moon where they counted the months, and then the cycle of 360 days per year, they counted their years, and they had a leap year thing happen where they would add a month that would fix everything every few years. Anyway, they based it all on the movement of the stars, the moon and the sun, not the stars, but the moon and the sun, as described in the book of Enoch, by the way, by God. But it's interesting, in the time Pope Gregory changed everything to kind of obscure this timeline and this way of calculating things, that all these different things happened in the same period in the 16th century. In 1540, the Jesuit order was founded. Now, I don't know if you studied much about the Jesuit order, but I feel that it was a very dark cloud came over the Catholic Church. Not that the Catholic Church was perfect, but I think that the Jesuit order made it even more corrupt, and that there's the possibility that the Jesuit order, as of that time period, slowly began to gain control of the Catholic Church. But the Jesuit order was founded. Then in 1543, Copernicus publishes his De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. And I think that's on the revolution of the sun, if I'm not mistaken. I may be mistaken. My Latin is not very good. But that was his book that established the heliocentric model of the universe, all right? That the sun was the center of things and not the earth, as had been believed for millennia before him, all right? It's just interesting that all these things started to happen at the same time. Then in 1582 is when Pope Gregory establishes the Gregorian calendar. And of course, when the Pope says something at that time period, it went throughout the known world very quickly. And all the Catholic nations or Christian nations, they took on the Gregorian calendar immediately. And this, of course, obscured the real history, the real time frame of history, and the prophecy that we've been talking about. But then in 1615, Galileo defends heliocentrism in the Catholic Inquisition. And this essentially cements the heliocentric view of cosmology and the modern view of the universe into the modern consciousness, into Western consciousness. And so it's just interesting that all these things occurred at the same time, and that's why our years are calculated the way they are. It's why we no longer stick to a lunar solar type year and month calculation. I just leave that as food for thought, because I think throughout history, Satan has worked through men to try to obscure this 5,500 years from creation to Christ. And we've now seen that this prophecy was, reinforced again and again by ancient writings and by the early church fathers and Christian writings. And it's just the Septuagint timeline holds to it and reaffirms it. And to me, it's overwhelming. And that's why I brought this video forward to you. I hope this has been exciting for you. I love this stuff. And again, this has taken a long time to assemble all this information, but praise God I was able to do it and get it to you. And I think that this has been profitable. So thank you again for joining. I hope that you and your families are staying safe during this time. Be prepared and keep them safe. And God bless you as you go. Thank you.